Welcome to our Reform Movements lecture. In this lecture you will learn about how the Second Great Awakening contributed to widespread social reform movements during the mid-1800s. By the end of this lecture you need to be able to describe the Second Great Awakening and explain how it contributed to social reform. Describe the abolitionist, temperance, education, prison, mental health, and women's suffrage movements. Explain the contributions of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Horace Mann, Dorothea Dix, Lucretia Mott, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. The Second Great Awakening was a series of religious revivals that really reached its peak between about 1820 and 1840. Some effects of it was that it increased church membership and participation in the church. Lots of people went to these outdoor revival meetings. That's what you see in the picture, where they camp out and they'd spend hours upon hours every day listening to sermons. It also provided for greater roles for women in the church. Women had been largely excluded from participating in religious ceremonies, and it was often believed that they couldn't interpret the Bible. This starts to change. Many new religious groups are going to form at this time, like the Church of Jesus Christ for Latter-day Saints. They're going to have different beliefs. Some of them are going to be persecuted for their beliefs. Some of the central ideas of the Second Great Awakening were that a person should try and promote a heaven on earth and try and live a very pure life. Also that religion should be more equitable and democratic, that people of all genders and races are entitled to have a relationship with God. And if you go back to the First Great Awakening in the time of the Puritans, it was something that was considered very much the sphere of men, especially white men, to have control over the church and be able to interpret the Bible. The Second Great Awakening is going to have a powerful influence on reform movements because these people are going to be very concerned with trying to basically clean up society and make it more pure, create this heaven on earth. So you're going to see a lot of powerful reform movements that grow out of this time. The abolitionist movement was the movement to end slavery. The temperance movement was to reduce or eliminate the consumption of alcohol. And then the women's suffrage movement was about getting the right to vote for women. Here's your first practice. Pause the video so you can answer these true-false questions. So before we talk about the abolitionist movement, let's talk a little bit about life under slavery, which we've been learning about, but let's talk about it a little bit more. So in the South, slaves were considered property. They were not considered people. They did not have rights under the law. They were bought and sold at slave auctions. Families were often separated. And even when they were separated, often they tried to communicate with one another. Sometimes they tried to escape to get to the other person, but families could be separated very easily. Slaveholders controlled slaves with a combination of very harsh punishments and laws called slave codes. Slave codes were the state laws that existed to try and maintain the control of whites over slaves. Some examples of slave codes would include laws that prevented slaves from either traveling outside of their area or their state. Also literacy laws that made it illegal for slaves to learn how to read and write. Now, slaves resisted their captivity in many different ways. Some of the more passive ways would be for them to engage in work slowdowns or do poor quality work and just make it difficult for their masters to make a lot of money off them. Some more active ways that slaves resisted were they could run away, but often they were caught, and once they were returned, they would suffer very harsh punishment. There were incidents of slave rebellions and slave uprisings. This was really the greatest fear of the slave owners. One of the most successful ones, at least temporarily, was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Turner was a slave who believed he had had religious visions. He led about 75 slaves in a rebellion in Virginia. Over the course of their rebellion, they managed to kill about 51 whites. He fled into the wilderness and hid out in caves for about 6 weeks before he was captured. Once he was captured, he was hung along with 16 of his followers. Another 56 slaves were executed for participating in the rebellion. Hundreds of slaves were either beaten or killed by angry mobs or by white militias that were formed to try and put down the rebellion. By the 1830s, many Americans, especially in the North, are supporting the abolition of slavery. And abolition is the act of ending something, a system or practice or an institution. So abolishing slavery would mean to end it forever and wipe it out. Abolitionists were working for emancipation, which means freedom from slavery. So abolition is the act of ending it forever. Emancipation is when somebody is freed and liberated. One attempt was by a group called the American Colonization Society. Now, the American Colonization Society supported the migration of free African Americans to Africa. So it was a way to kind of, I guess, return them to the land that they had been taken from. The society founded the colony of Liberia in Africa. This was largely a failure, and it was viewed as a racist policy. Many of the freed slaves were American by birth and culture. Many of them, they had been born in the United States. Their parents had been born in the United States. Their grandparents had been born in the United States. So they were completely out of touch with African culture. In addition to this, conditions in Africa were terrible at this time. And less than half of those that migrated to Liberia ended up surviving. So it was largely a failed policy. Many abolitionists in the United States were using newspapers to try and spread their speeches and their messages. And we learned about how Andrew Jackson, when he was president, one of the policies that he had was to try and restrict abolitionist newspapers from being mailed in the South. Do your practice number 2. Pause the video so you can answer these true-false questions. One of the early, more prominent abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison. He was founder and editor of an abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, which he founded in 1831. He was also a founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which advocated for the immediate emancipation of all slaves. And this is a little different than the more popular view was that slavery should be gradually phased out. William Lloyd Garrison thought that that was unjust, that slavery should just be ended immediately. He also advocated for women to have the right to vote. Many people, though, they considered him to be a bit of an extremist. Like I said, most people didn't want slavery to end right away. They wanted it to sort of gradually just sort of disappear. They thought it would cause too big of a cultural disruption and an economic disruption. But Garrison wanted it ended right away. Another important abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. He escaped slavery as a young man, very intelligent, taught himself to read and write. Then he used his skills to try and educate other slaves. He read the work of Garrison and joined the American Anti-Slavery Society and became a very prominent abolitionist writer and speaker. He wrote several autobiographies in his lifetime. His first one was written in 1845 called The Narrative of the Slave of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He also founded the North Star newspaper. The North Star was used as a guide for slaves that were escaping the South, so they would be able to travel at night to the North. One of his more famous speeches was made in 1852, and it's made during the 4th of July, and he says in his speech, "What to a slave is the 4th of July?" And he basically says that freedom and liberty is all a scam, and it has never applied to slaves. It's been very exclusive to white men, and that it's kind of hypocritical to celebrate that day as being a day of liberty and freedom when there are still slaves in the United States. Here's practice number 3. Do these true-false questions. So the Underground Railroad was a loosely associated network of both whites and blacks that helped slaves escape from the South. The hiding places, the houses and the businesses where they would camp out during the day, were nicknamed stations, and the people who helped guide the slaves over the course of the night or who operated the stations were called conductors. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman was an ex-slave who made, by some accounts, as many as 19 trips back and forth to the South, rescuing more than 70 slaves in the process. Some sources say she rescued as many as 300, but she disputed that claim. She carried a gun for protection and also to encourage cooperation in her passengers. And she was known for saying, basically, you're going to be free or you're going to die. So she was a hardcore, tough lady. During the American Civil War, she worked as a spy and a scout in the South. Very formidable woman. Another woman who took a very active role in trying to end slavery was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was a writer, an abolitionist, and also a women's rights advocate. Her book in 1851, it reflected her deeply Christian beliefs that slavery was at odds with her religion. In its first year, it sold over 300,000 copies in America and over 1 million in Britain. It portrayed the violence and terror that slaves faced, and it woke a lot of people up that lived in the North that had never been around slavery, never experienced it, to see how horrible it really was. I mean, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, families are separated. I believe Tom himself is murdered by his owner, things like that. So people start to see that this isn't something that's all warm and fuzzy. This is something that's really horrific, and it's happening, and it needs to end. Now, there was still a lot of opposition to ending slavery. Many Southerners felt that slavery was essential to their cotton economy. They thought, if we do not have this slave labor, our entire economy and, in turn, our culture is just going to collapse. There were also many whites across the country that felt that blacks were simply inferior and not entitled to the same rights as other Americans. Racism wasn't something that was exclusive to the South. It existed everywhere in the United States at that time. Some argued that blacks could not care for themselves and that they needed the structure of slavery to survive. Basically, that they were too stupid to exist on their own, which is kind of ridiculous, but lots of people believed that, at least white people. There were also a lot of northern workers, especially low-income workers and immigrants, that were afraid that if the slaves were freed, they would end up migrating to the north into the cities to go work in factories, and that because they were starting from scratch, they would be willing to work for lower wages, and in turn that they would steal their jobs. One of the prominent abolitionists in Congress that I think is really noteworthy is John Quincy Adams. This is the former president of the United States. He ends up serving in the House of Representatives. He's probably more productive in the House of Representatives than he ever was as a president. He worked to overturn a gag rule that was in Congress that basically prevented Congress from discussing anti-slavery petitions. He helped end that so slavery could at least be debated on the floor in Congress. He's also known for defending some escaped slaves that revolted aboard a slave ship called the Amistad, and he defended them in court. Here's your practice number 4. Pause the video so you can answer these true-false questions. So there's a connection between this abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. Many prominent abolitionists like Garrison, Douglas, Tubman, and Stowe also fought to get the right to vote for women. So these two movements are very closely linked. Many people saw parallels between the status of slaves and also of women at that time. Both of these groups were denied rights, they were denied equal treatment, and they were not allowed to participate in the government or vote. So the main goal of the women's rights movement was to gain suffrage. And suffrage is the right to vote. Another term you need to know is suffragist. A suffragist is a member of a political movement that is working to get the right to vote. And a suffragette is a nickname given to the women who are seeking the right to vote. So let's go back to early American history and the 1600s and look at how the first women are going to arrive in the British colonies, because it's important to see how they arrived and their early experiences so we can understand their status in American society even in the 1800s. So the earliest settlements like Jamestown were almost entirely men. Some women came as indentured servants or also as purchased brides. One of the first big groups to arrive in Jamestown was in 1619, and you have 90 women who arrive on ships. They were described as agreeable persons, young and incorrupt, sold with their own consent to settlers as wives, the price to be the cost of their own transportation. So in order to travel across the ocean, these women are committing to marriages to men that they have never met. There were 18 married women on the Mayflower, and due to death by either childbirth or sickness, 14 of those women had died by the spring. And especially when you look at women for that time in medical care, childbirth was a very dangerous thing for women back then. And when you combine the dangers of childbirth and the hostile conditions, it was very hard for women. So some of the earliest forms of resistance by women, one was Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson was in Puritan, Massachusetts, and she argued that women could be close to God without the help of men. She was put on trial several times for her religious beliefs. At her second trial, I believe, she was pregnant at the time. They made her stand for hours and hours. Eventually, I think she collapsed. She ended up being banished from Massachusetts because of what she was teaching people. She was followed by dozens of families. They ended up trying to resettle in the area of Rhode Island and were attacked by Native Americans who thought that they were people who had cheated them out of their land, and she and all of her followers were killed. One of the people that spoke up for Anne Hutchinson was a woman named Mary Dyer. And Mary Dyer was a Quaker by birth, and since she had different religious beliefs from the Puritans, she's going to be persecuted by them. The Puritans claimed that when she had a stillborn birth, that was because of her heretical religious ideas as a Quaker. And she at one point left the colony and then later comes back, and they end up hanging her for her different religious beliefs. This is practice number 5. Pause the video so you can answer these true-false questions. So in the mid-1800s, women were working hard to defend their rights to all kinds of things. Women were not permitted to speak in public. They weren't allowed to give speeches. They weren't expected to have opinions. The popular view, especially by men, was women weren't intelligent enough. They didn't have the wit to develop a sound opinion on anything. Few women could work and earn wages. If they did work and earn wages, they had no rights to keep those wages. Those wages became the property of either their husband if they were married, or a father or a brother if they were unmarried. They weren't allowed to own property in many states. They weren't allowed to make purchasing decisions. Because the view of the law was that women intellectually were weaker, they weren't allowed to sit on juries, they weren't allowed to be witnesses in court, because it was believed they couldn't accurately recollect events, and they weren't allowed to vote. So they were treated as inferiors to men, not just in the culture, but it was written into the law. Women were trained at a very early age to act a certain way. Women were expected to be cheerful, quiet, chaste, attractive, religious, ignorant, and compliant. Their role was to act as a nurse, cook, cleaner, and seamstress, and as a mother. And really, their role as a wife was to support their husband. And that was their main responsibility, to make sure that his life is happy and that everything is pleasant and taken care of for him. So this women's movement is going to start to grow. And with all these social changes that are going on and the new sort of ideas of the Second Great Awakening, you're going to see the rise of the women's movement. So you're going to have Women gaining employment opportunities in factories. We already learned about the textile mills, like the Lowell mills where women are going to work. Also, women are going to start to get better educational opportunities, so that's going to give them access to more information and opportunities for newer employment and better employment. They're also going to work in reform groups, and their work in reform groups is going to teach them how to organize and work together. You know, the Lowell girls going on strike, and a lot of these other reform movements, like the abolitionist movement, is going to go on. It's going to teach these women how to organize. They're also going to have some men that begin to fight for women's rights. And we've already learned about a couple of these guys, like William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass. And these guys find it unacceptable that women were not considered equal. There was a lot of opposition to women's rights, and even among women. And these were anti-suffragists, so people who did not want to give women the right to vote. Some women did not believe they needed more rights. They thought that women were not unequal, they're only different. Some also believed that women should not work in public for social changes, that their role was to work from within the home, and that they should hide their actions, focus on their family. If they want to make social changes, then they should do so by convincing their husbands and their sons and their fathers to make those kind of changes. There was also a lot of belief that women lacked both the physical or mental strength to deal with issues, that they needed men's protection, and that they couldn't cope with complicated issues. And their husband needed to control their property and their money because they wouldn't make sound decisions with their own money. One example of them being viewed as this sort of weaker sex is this thing right here. This is called a fainting couch. This is something you would have found in lots of wealthy homes back in the early 1800s. And we've all seen like the old movies where something happens and then some woman faints. You know, she gets scared or frightened or something stressful and she faints. Well, this was something that was common enough that they actually built couches for it. And if some wealthy woman, she fainted, she'd be carried off to her fainting couch in her parlor where she could quietly and slowly wake up into a nice calm environment. And this is something that looks kind of silly when we watch it in a movie because we wouldn't think of any woman just passing out because something stressful happened today. But this did happen back then. I've read a lot of research about why this would happen. Why would these women back then, they just faint? The most convincing argument I've ever heard was it was due to the clothes that they had to wear. Because women often had to wear these corsets that were cinched up because women were expected to have this sort of perfect figure. So they would be laced up in these super tight corsets that would squeeze their waist and their midsection to make it really narrow. But one of the problems with that would be that they would have trouble breathing. So the theory that I've read that I thought was the most convincing was that not being able to take deep breaths when their heart rate accelerates, when they're stressed or when they're frightened, they would end up passing out. There were a lot of propaganda that was put out by the anti-suffragists. This one here is not too subtle in its reference. Which do you prefer, the home or the street corner for a woman? So you've got this happy woman with her baby at home. She's not causing any problems or out protesting. And then you've got this suffragette right here with her voting sign, and she's out on the street corner. The connotation being that if she's out there, she's some kind of a prostitute. So the temperance movement is going to grow with the women's movement. The temperance movement was the movement to ban or limit alcohol. And women played a very strong role in this movement. And many women thought alcohol was a destructive force on their marriages and their families. The United States in the 1800s was very much a drinking culture. There were a lot of men who drank a lot. And for many women, this was the source of their problems. Their husbands were gone, they were drinking, they weren't participating in anything at home, they'd come home drunk, they'd beat their wife, they'd beat their family, they'd spend all their money, and women had no legal protection under the law. So at that time, in most states, a man could physically punish his wife, and as long as he did not kill her or permanently disable her, she had no protection. So women viewed alcohol as a catalyst of this. Many states started to pass temperance laws in the 1800s, and we're going to see all this kind of culminate in an amendment in the early 1900s that's going to prohibit alcohol in the Constitution. And that'll eventually be overturned, but that's kind of the culmination of this temperance movement. There was also a big movement to improve public education, and a couple of the important people that we want to look at here, one of them is Horace Mann. Horace Mann was a legislator in Massachusetts, and a lot of his ideas about education are going to gain widespread approval all across the Northeast. He had a couple of main themes to his work. One was that education should be universal. It should be something that everybody can get access to. Also, that it should be free from influence of religious groups or political opinion. It should be available at no charge to everybody. And that the ultimate goal of education should be to make better, more informed citizens who can make better decisions when they vote. An important woman who was involved in this public education movement was Elizabeth Blackwell. She was the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States in 1849. There was a lot of drama and concern when she applied to medical school. The board of her medical school that handled applications was unsure whether they should admit this woman and create this new precedent. They actually put the vote to all of the men who were students there, and they asked the men, should we admit her? And it was unanimous that they all agreed that she should be admitted. She did well in school. After she graduated and became a doctor, she founded a hospital, and she also helped recruit lots of women into the healthcare profession, not just as doctors, but nurses and things like that. Here's practice number 6. Pause the video so you can answer these true-false questions. Now, if it was bad to be a woman and it was bad to be a slave, it was especially bad to be a woman slave. And that's where it's useful to look at Sojourner Truth. So Sojourner Truth was a slave. She was born and given the name Isabella Baumfree. She escaped from slavery with her infant daughter in 1826. She changed her name after she escaped from slavery to Sojourner Truth. Sojourner means a traveler, so there's probably a lot of meaning in her name because she did do a lot of traveling and she did tell people how it was. She won a court case against a white man at one point to get one of her children out of slavery, which was really rare for a black woman to win a court case against a man with as loaded as the legal system was against them. She was an advocate for both abolition and women's suffrage. She herself was illiterate, but she was a gifted and effective public speaker. Her most famous speech has been called the Ain't I a Woman speech. And in her Ain't I a Woman speech, she is responding to a man who says basically that women can never be equal in the eyes of God because Christ was a man. And in her speech, she's going to argue that if women can suffer as well as any man, which she had suffered as a slave and taken the lash as well as any man, she had been without food and survived as well as any man. She's going to argue if she can suffer as well as any man, then she deserves to have her fair share of rights. I'll try and put a link to a video of an actress doing her speech so you can see it and you can get an idea of how powerful her words could be. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the great writers of the women's suffrage movement. In 1840, she was an abolitionist. She attended a World Anti-Slavery Convention in London, England. So she traveled all the way across the ocean to participate in this convention. And when she and a bunch of other women arrived, they were not allowed to participate because they were women. And this was highfalutin man talk. So the women were all forced to sit behind a curtain in a separate room to shield them from all this intellectual conversation that these men believed that they couldn't handle. And this is going to enrage her, and it's going to inspire her to action. Interestingly enough, one of the men who attended that convention was William Lloyd Garrison, and he was so upset by how the women were treated that he himself went and sat with the women behind the curtain. which is a snub to the convention because he was probably, if not the most prominent abolitionist from the United States, at least one of them. When this happens, she's going to plan a convention in the United States, but one to advance the rights of women. This convention is going to be held in July of 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. It's going to be led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and one of her friends, Lucretia Mott. This is the first public meeting about women's rights held in the United States. And hundreds of women attended. There were also a lot of men that attended. Frederick Douglass was there. The main outcome of this convention was they wrote a Declaration of Sentiments, and it was a document that was purposefully modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And it's going to start off and it's going to follow along with the words, but instead of all men being created equal, it's all men and women are created equal. And it's going to explain the beliefs of the people who went to the convention about the social injustice that was going on towards women. And just like in the Declaration of Independence, there's a list of grievances. There's one in the Declaration of Sentiments, but instead of it being against the king in England, these are 18 grievances or charges against men, ways that men have stamped out women's rights and kept them from being considered equal. If Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the writer and the planner behind the abolitionist movement, Susan B. Anthony is the speaker and the point person. She helped organize the fight into a large-scale political movement. She fought for women's rights in a lot of areas, getting equal pay for equal work, women being able to enter professions that were dominated by men, like religion and the law, also getting women the right to own their own property. New York finally gave married women ownership of their wages and property due to the work of Susan B. Anthony. Her most famous sort of incident, she was put on trial for voting illegally. At her trial, she wasn't allowed to speak on her behalf until the very end of the trial when the sentencing was going on, and she defiantly said she would never pay the fines that she was supposed to pay. She was actually put on a dollar coin back in the 1980s. Coin didn't last very long, though, because it looked a lot like a quarter, and people were confusing them with quarters. I'm old enough to remember all that. Another prominent women's rights advocate was Lucy Stone. She was the first female college graduate in Massachusetts. She was a top student of her class and was asked to write the commencement address for the school. But because women were not allowed to speak in public, she was told that she was not allowed to read it. And so she declined to do the speech if she wouldn't be allowed to read it herself. She often lectured in her brother's church, and she was kind of made famous by being probably one of the first women in the United States to not take her husband's name in marriage. She also didn't pay her taxes because she felt like the government didn't do anything for her, so why should she pay taxes? She was a very gifted speaker on both abolition and women's rights. And she would give speeches. There were times where she gave speeches where she had books thrown at her, she was attacked by mobs, but yet she would still go out and she'd still give her speeches even though she was in danger when she did so. So, along with all these reform movements, there's also going to be reform movements directed at trying to improve conditions for the mentally ill and in prisons. And this is also part of this Second Great Awakening belief that we need to create a better world. And we need to avoid sin and create this heaven on earth. So mental health back in the 1800s, it was not understood. It was not taken very seriously. The mentally ill were usually kept in asylums or in prisons, and usually in horrendous conditions with little or no treatment for their actual illness. They'd be locked up in cages, sometimes chained up, with no treatment. Prisons back then had very little funding and also had horrendous conditions. Sometimes men, women, and children were all thrown together in prisons without regard to their sentence or what types of crimes they committed. Being in prison at that time, you wouldn't survive long. It was terrible. One woman who worked to try and improve conditions in the mental health institutions in the prisons was Dorothea Dix, and she crusaded for the reform of these institutions. She started off by visiting them and gathering evidence about their conditions. At one point, she spoke before the Massachusetts legislature and to secure state funding for better prisons and hospitals. Here's practice number 7. With this one, I want you to put the name of the woman who's being described. So the women's rights movement has had some successes and some failures. The 19th Amendment was the amendment that gave women suffrage. This is going to take until 1920 before women get the right to vote. So women have had the right to vote in this country for less than 100 years. Now, some of the states had already been giving women suffrage. Wyoming was the first, and it granted women suffrage in 1869. Florida, our own state, denied women the right to vote until the 19th Amendment forced them to give women the right to vote. There was another amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment that was going to guarantee equal rights for everyone regardless of sex. This was proposed in 1921 to go with women's suffrage, and it finally failed ratification in 1979. There was a lot of conservative opposition to this, headed by a woman, actually, named Phyllis Schlafly. She argued that the Equal Rights Amendment would hurt housewives and also that it would allow women to be drafted, which is interesting because we had a federal court ruled that women should be eligible for the draft last week, actually. Alright, practice number 8. Write the last name of the person being described. So this goes through the entire PowerPoint. All the abolitionists, the women's rights advocates, reform movements, all that. So write the last name.